Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 89. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 56 and 57 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of virtue and of the intellectual virtues. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether the subject of virtue is a power of the soul. So is the specific category of habits we have termed virtues within or modifying the faculties of our soul, the intellect and will and passions, for example? And St. Thomas says yes, and supports his position in the following words. First, from the notion of the very essence of virtue, which implies perfection of a power. Secondly, from the fact that virtue is an operative habit, as we have said, for all operation proceeds from the soul through a power. Thirdly, from the fact that virtue disposes to that which is best, for the best is the end, which is either a thing's operation or something acquired by an operation. Article 2, whether one virtue can be in several powers. Could the virtue of justice, for example, reside not only in the will, but also in the intellect? Can a single virtue be in various powers? And this cannot be the case because habits are dispositions of powers, and powers, by having very definite objects and acts, can only be further disposed in certain definite, specific kinds of ways. For example, the intellect, as the power to know, can only contain dispositions which modify that general act, such as the habit of understanding, which is the habit of first principles, or the habit of science, which is the habitual knowledge of certain conclusions. And so we cannot even really imagine what it would mean for virtues of the appetite, such as justice or courage or temperance, to be dispositions of the intellect, because they don't deal with knowing, but instead of willing. And a word from Aquinas, diversity of powers follows the generic conditions of the objects, while diversity of habits follows the specific conditions thereof. And so wherever there is diversity of powers, there is diversity of habits. Article 3, whether the intellect can be the subject of virtue. As a guide to this question, St. Thomas writes, since virtue is that which makes its possessor good, and his work good likewise, habits are called virtuous simply because they make the work to be actually good, and the subject good simply. So in brief, there is a way in which science, wisdom, and understanding can be considered virtues as good dispositions of the mind, but if we limit the term virtue to those habits which are not only perfective of their respective subject, but also make a person's actions good, then those habits must find themselves in some relation to the will, since good action is dependent upon a good will. As St. Thomas says, the philosopher holds that science, wisdom, and understanding, and also art, are intellectual virtues, but the subject of a habit, which is called a virtue, simply can only be the will, or some power insofar as it is moved by the will. If man do well actually, this is because he has a good will. Article 4, whether the irascible and concupiscible powers are the subject of virtue. As we said in a previous article, insofar as powers are related to the will, or flow from the will's action, we can call them subject of virtue, which Aquinas will, in regard to the intellect, for example, write, now it happens that the intellect is moved by the will, just as are the other powers, for a man considers something actually because he wills to do so, and therefore the intellect, insofar as it is subordinate to the will, can be the subject of virtue, absolutely so called. And we have something similar here in regard to a man's passions or emotions. Insofar as a man's passions are rightly disposed by the will, they too can be said to be subject to virtue. The helpful example given here is the relationship between a craftsman and his tools. In Aquinas' words, the act of a craftsman cannot be successful unless both the craftsman and his instrument be well disposed to act. Therefore, the virtue which is in the irascible and concupiscible powers is nothing else but a certain habitual conformity of these powers to reason. So as our passions follow the command of reason, as they are habitually moved by a man's deliberate choice and acquire a kind of disposition thereby, they can be said to be subject of virtue. Article 5, whether the sensitive powers of apprehension are the subject of virtue. Sensual memory, for example, which would be a sensitive power of apprehension, receives a lot of attention in this article and is a good example for our question. And although it is an integral part, or something required for the proper or perfect act of the intellect, since the interior and exterior senses are common to us and also irrational animals who are not more or less virtuous, then we must respond to this article in the negative. However, the apprehensive senses, such as the memory, can improve through habitual use, as St. Thomas will say here. In remembering one thing after another, we become used to it and use it as second nature. And as a helpful last word on why we don't consider the sensitive, apprehensive powers subject to virtue, but do consider the sensitive, appetitive powers to be, i.e. the passions, St. Thomas writes, the sensitive appetite is related to the will, which is the rational appetite through being moved by it. And therefore the act of the appetitive power is consummated in the sensitive appetite. And for this reason, the sensitive appetite is the subject of virtue, whereas the sensitive powers of apprehension are related to the intellect rather through moving it, and therefore the act of knowledge is terminated in the intellect, and for this reason the cognizant virtues are in the intellect itself, or the reason. Article 6, whether the will can be the subject of virtue. The will does not, according to Aquinas, require a habit or disposition for it to tend naturally to that good proportionate to its nature and proposed to it by reason. But in our fallen state, the will does need to affect proper dispositions in our sensitive appetite, temperance, and courage, or those passions are going to throw off or skew what we take to be the true good. And even if one had perfect disposition of his or her sensitive appetites, the will would still need to be perfected in regard to those goods either outside of us, namely in regard to someone else, or above us. The good outside ourselves is the good of our neighbor, which requires the perfective habit of justice in the will, and the good above ourselves is the attainment of God via the beatific vision, which requires the habit of charity. So in order to will rightly in regard to God and neighbor, the will requires the virtues of justice and charity, and so can be subject to virtue. And so we move on to question 57 of the intellectual virtues. Article 1, whether habits of the speculative intellect are virtues. And it's good to begin here by rehashing our working definition of virtue, which is, in part, that by which we live righteously, of which no one can make bad use. And because one can certainly use their habitual knowledge for good or evil, Aquinas writes, the habits of the speculative intellect do not perfect the appetitive part, nor affect it in any way, but only the intellective part. They may indeed be called virtues insofar as they confer aptness for a good work vis-a-vis the consideration of truth, since this is the good work of the intellect. So insofar as intellectual dispositions confer an aptness or assist the will in its application to good work, they can be called virtues. As St. Thomas will continue in writing, a virtue which perfects the will, as charity or justice, confers the right use of these speculative habits. And in this way, too, there can be merit in the acts of these habits if they be done out of charity. Article 2, whether there are only 3 habits of the speculative intellect, wisdom, science, and understanding. We have the capacity to know a thing either in itself or through another. I know that God must exist or must not exist, and I know that through a first principle I know in itself, and that is the principle of non-contradiction. The sciences of physics, for example, are based on the understanding of first principles, such as that principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason. But higher than both, the habit of science and the habit of understanding is the habit of wisdom, which contains the knowledge of the highest causes in any particular genus. In St. Thomas's words, science depends on understanding, as on virtue of higher degree, and both of these depend on wisdom, as obtaining the highest place, and containing beneath itself both understanding and science, by judging both of the conclusions of science and of the principles on which they are based. That is why Aquinas calls the sacred doctrine, or teaching given by God, wisdom. Article 3, whether the intellectual habit art is a virtue. Beginning with the definition of art, St. Thomas writes, art is nothing else but the right reason about certain works to be made. And so the question is, should we call it a virtue? And keeping in mind our definition of virtue, which is in part that by which we live righteously and of which no one can make bad use of, I think all of us can agree that skill and craftsmanship can definitely be used for evil or for good. And therefore, if it is to be called a virtue, it must receive some additional qualification above the general definition of art. The qualification that is added by Aquinas is that if skill in work is helpful, like the intellectual virtues, to a certain aptness or facility in work in coordination with the will, then it can be called a virtue. In his words, so art has the nature of a virtue in the same way as the speculative habits, insofar to wit as neither art nor speculative habit makes a good work as regards the use of the habit, which is the property of a virtue that perfects the appetite, but only as regards the aptness to work well. Article 4, whether prudence is a distinct virtue from art. What is prudence? It is right reason of things to be done, and art is right reason of things to be made. Art can be considered a virtue only insofar as it concerns aptness to a good work, but prudence is required or essential to good work because for an action to be good, not only must its intended end be good, which is the object of the will, but also the means must be correct, which comes under the purview of prudence. And prudence, for its part, requires rectitude of the will, and art does not, in order for us to command the correct means, which is sufficient to distinguish it from art, which was the question of this article. In St. Thomas's words, it is requisite for prudence, which is right reason about things to be done, that man be well disposed with regard to the ends, and this depends on the rectitude of his appetite. Article 5, whether prudence is a virtue necessary to man. As we continue our investigation into prudence, St. Thomas begins this article with the words of Scripture. This is Wisdom chapter 8, verse 7. And if anyone loves righteousness, her labors are virtues, for she teaches self-control and prudence, justice, and courage. Nothing in life is more profitable for men than these. And so prudence is necessary, because as we mentioned already, not only must the end be correct, but also the means, in order for the action to be good. And the command of the means, as influenced by the will and as a perfective disposition of the mind, is what we mean by prudence. As Aquinas writes, to that which is suitably ordained to the due end, man needs to be rightly disposed by a habit in the reason, because counsel and choice, which are about things ordained to the end, are acts of the reason. Consequently, an intellectual virtue is needed in the reason to perfect the reason and make it suitably affected towards things ordained to the end, and this virtue is prudence. Consequently, prudence is a virtue necessary to lead a good life. And now, Article 6, our last article, whether eubolia, synesis, and nome are virtues annexed to prudence. And I hope I'm pronouncing those correctly. First of all, what do we mean by annexed virtues? To quote Aquinas later in the Summa, he writes, 2 points must be considered about the virtues annexed to a principal virtue. The first is that these virtues have something in common with the principal virtue, and the second is that in some respect they fall short of the perfection of that virtue. So, for example, in the virtue of justice, the virtue piety, which is rendering to a superior, like one's parents, what is their due, is similar to justice, and rendering to another what is due, but more specific in that it is specifically addressed in regard to one's superior. So when it comes to prudence, those virtues annexed to it would be those which do not relate to the mind's act of commanding the means, but in regard to inquiry and judgment about the means. And these are the annexed virtues mentioned in our article heading, all of which have strange names because they're likely being pulled from the Greek of Aristotle, but the first, eubolia, is the virtue of right inquiry, Synesis is the virtue of good judgment in regard to common laws, and nome, the virtue of good judgment in natural law when the common law fails to apply. And that brings us to the close of another episode on the virtues. We have just finished covering questions 56 and 57 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of virtue and of the intellectual virtues. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.